The United States of America is the most powerful country in human history, with the more than 800 military bases around the world, consuming about 37% of the world's military expenditures. That is, one-third of all the power of human civilization is concentrated in the hands of one country. This allows to be the leader of the global system, to influence the policies of any country, to regulate the level of conflict and to set the rules of the game in this world. To understand how America achieved such power, we must go back to the origins, to the creation of the United States. At that time, America has just jettisoned its status as a colony of Great Britain. In the first 70 years of its independence, the US had expanded into the Pacific Ocean, exterminated millions of Indians, attempted to annex British Canada, and took California and Texas from Mexico. Having established total hegemony over the continent, American society was divided, some believing that expansion should continue beyond the Pacific and Atlantic, others rejecting it, wishing to pursue isolationist policies and eradicate slavery. Those two main political forces emerged in America: Republicans in the North and Democrats in the South. These and many other disagreements between the North and the South set the stage for the Civil War. At the end of the war, the Republican North prevailed and amended the US Constitution, particularly the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in all states. Post-war Secretary of the State Stewart said that America must become a global power. He succeeded in his plan to buy Alaska from Russia, but his attempts to buy Greenland and Iceland and to buy territories in the Caribbean were blocked by Congress. The fact is that some Americans had strong anti-imperialist sentiments. These people worried that America was becoming increasingly involved in global politics instead of dealing with the integration of people of color into American society and other pressing issues. This opposition provided a significant deterrent to imperial ambitions, but in the late 1800s something happened that made the debate about American expressionism meaningless. It was the Industrial Revolution. It triggered explosive economic growth, and the US needed to become a more centralized state with a strong bureaucracy to run the new economy. Power concentrated in the federal government. This allowed such presidents like William McKinley to unilaterally advance their policies and spread the influence of the United States. From words to deeds, McKinley got the United States into a conflict with Spain over Cuba in 1898. The result was not only Cuba, but also Puerto Rico, Guam, and Philippines. Over the next 2 years, the US annexed Hawaii, Wake Island, and American Samoa. A few years later, the US gained control of the Panama Canal Zone. This period gave the US the title of a global power. At this time, America also began to use its influence to protect its commercial and military interests abroad, installing pro-American regimes in Nicaragua, for example, playing an important role in international diplomacy between the West and China along the way. World War I showed how much sense there was in American influence. The intervention of the United States was a decisive factor in the war, and President Wilson, present at the Paris Peace Conference, proposed the creation of the League of Nations. At the time, it was an ambitious decision. It's how the European states are in solidarity with each other on many things, but in those days they were ready to clutch at each other's throats. So the League of Nations called for the promotion of world peace, which in theory should have led to a complete restructuring of global politics. But the US Congress pursued a policy of isolationism and blocked the United States from joining the League of Nations, dooming Wilson's project to failure. During the Great Depression and Hitler's rise, the US was fixated more on itself than on European affairs. Nevertheless, by developing economic and political ties abroad, America couldn't turn a blind eye to global changes in the world. In East Asia, the growing Japanese empire began to see the US as a problem and a threat to its imperial ambitions. As a result, the Japanese risked an attack on Pearl Harbor in an effort to weaken the US military presence in the Pacific. and ended up personally living with a powerful enemy who dropped two atomic bombs on them. World War II changed America's status in the world forever. The US was the only major power and escaped economic collapse during the war, the only country to possess its nuclear weapons. Many believe that the use of atomic bombs in Japan was unnecessary, but it was really just a show of force to the world. So that with the strongest economy on one side and nuclear weapons on the other, the Americans were able to impose their conditions on the war. But to rely on brute force indefinitely is foolish, and the Americans understood this very well. In the first place, the US sought to prevent another global conflict in the world. The most famous example of this is the creation of the United Nations. The UN Charter established a system of international law prohibiting wars of conquest, such as those the Nazis and Japanese set up. The UN became a forum where the international community could speak out and resolve contentious issues. As a result, Americans hoped the great powers could resolve their difference through compromise and law rather than through war and force. But the UN was not the only trump card the US had. 730 delegates from 44 allied countries gathered in a small resort in New Hampshire. You know what for? To set up a global financial system that would, first, prevent another Great Depression, and second, reduce the chances of another world war. This agreement was called Bretton Woods and eventually became the foundation of the global financial system. It led to the dominance of the dollar throughout the world, the creation of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. By creating all of these institutions, the United States assumed the leading role. Sounds good here, but the world's second economy, the Soviet Union, saw the world order very differently. During World War II, the democratic West and the communist East became allies against Hitler, but this alliance couldn't last forever. The United States didn't like the expansion of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe and elsewhere around the world. They saw it as a direct threat to their concept of free trade in the world. Fearing Soviet intentions toward Western Europe, the United States and other European countries created the NATO bloc, a military alliance designed to prevent the Soviet Union from invading other European countries. The US chose a strategy of containment because it was aimed at limiting the spread of communism around the world. This led to main results. First, the US made alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel and South Korea. The Americans never saw them as real allies. They were only needed as support to fight communism. Second, the US began to intervene, often covertly, in dozens of countries to contain Soviet influence. Sometimes this meant supporting dictators, such as in Iran, sometimes supplying arms and money to strangers, as in Afghanistan since 1979 and Nicaragua in 1985. During the Cold War, the US intervened in hundreds of conflicts around the world, resulting in a complex system of alliances and relationships in virtually every corner of the globe. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US exhaled, but in theory couldn't cut ties with unprofitable allies by reducing the size of its military. And although the US cut military spending, the plethora of military infrastructure and alliances created during the Cold War remained. Presidents George W. Bush and Bill Clinton concluded that both for America and for the world at large, US hegemony was a good thing. NATO, created solely as a tool to counter the Soviet Union, remained and even expanded to keep European nations united. Washington's support for countries like Israel and Japan has remained unchanged. This essentially guaranteed the prevention of a global war in these regions. The system of alliances and institutions created to maintain the balance during the Cold War continues to function to this day. And no leading American politician since the Cold War has seriously considered dismantling it. With the possible exception of Donald Trump, he believed that American allies were not paying the US enough to protect them and questioned the meaning of globalization. At the time, even the existence of NATO and the World Trade Organization seems to be in doubt. It seems that outdated regulations, cumbersome military budgets, and dubious alliances only burdened the US economy. But in fact, it turns out that maintaining NATO is not paranoia, but a real necessity. It is this monopoly or leadership position in various spheres of life that makes the United States the most powerful country that has ever existed in the history of mankind. Thank you all for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, put your like down below, and see you in the next video.